Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar. I'm Laura Whalen, a postdoctoral researcher at the Norwegian Veterinary Institute. As we begin today, I want to remind you all to please turn off your camera and your microphone. Should you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Katherine Koralesky. Katie is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia, where she examines social, moral, and ethical dimensions of gene editing in farm animals. Today, Katie will be presenting her PhD work, also completed at the University of British Columbia, where she used institutional ethnography to understand the social organization of animal sheltering and protection in Canada. Katie, the floor is yours.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura, for that introduction. Laura and I did our PhDs together here at UBC, so it's really nice to be together again. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here today. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm really excited to share some of my PhD research with you all. As Laura mentioned, I finished my PhD in December here at UBC, and I'm now continuing on in some postdoctoral work as well. And again, thank you so much, Laura and Christian, for organizing all of these webinars. Before I begin my talk, which is focused on the social organization of animal sheltering and protection in British Columbia, Canada, I want to acknowledge that where I am seated today and where this project took place is on the land which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. There we go. All right, so here's a brief outline of what I'd like to share with you all today. So first, I'll discuss and introduce you all to institutional ethnography, or IE, and I'll talk a little bit about how I use this for my thesis work. I'll then present some of the main findings for my thesis, starting with the social organization of animal shelter work. I'll then discuss the everyday work of providing alternative measures to keep people and animals together. And then I'll conclude with a short summary and some ideas for future research. So what is institutional ethnography, or IE? So this is a photo of Dorothy Smith. She's a Canadian sociologist. She'll be 96 years old this summer, so a pretty impressive person. She was part of the feminist movement that was happening in North America in the 1960s and 70s. And during this time, she began to reflect on two worlds that she was experiencing. One as a woman and a single mother, and another as a sociology instructor and academic. In particular, she thought about how the sociology that she had learned about as a graduate student and was then teaching was not actually in alignment with what she was really experiencing in her everyday life. Her colleagues at this time were almost all men, using theories that had been developed over time by men. And these theories were also then represented as general across all populations. However, women were not included in this process. Therefore, she concluded that this male-centeredness of sociology meant that what Smith as a woman experienced in her everyday life was not visible in sociology. Smith then began developing an alternative sociology that would shift away from the more conventional approaches that sociologists would use to do their research. IE is then an approach to inquiry that aims to discover what people are actually doing in the everyday world and explicate, and that means to describe in great detail, how these actions are being organized by institutional processes. I want to emphasize a few important IE principles. First, the ontological shift. For Smith, ontology is a theory of reality. So IE's ontological focus is on discovery, which means that inquiry begins in and stays in the actual material world through data, rather than relying on expanding theories about the world or hypotheses to test assumptions about the world. So this means that inquiry begins where people, or in this case, animals, actually are. Also, IE is grounded in examining the social, which is people's actual ongoing social processes that are coordinated with others. So this is not focused on interpreting what people said or what they're doing, but looking at and observing what they are actually doing. Finally, IE focuses on everyday knowledge. And what this is referring to is not only knowledge that people gain through work experiences, or what we might call experiential knowledge, but importantly and critically in IE, This everyday knowledge is the knowledge that all individuals in their everyday lives, and specifically in this study, frontline staff working in shelters, the knowledge that they have based on what it is actually like to do work every day. So around the time when Dorothy was developing IE, another woman, a bit younger than Dorothy, was beginning studies of chimpanzees in Tanzania. And this woman was Jane Goodall. Interestingly, Smith has brought up the work of Goodall and related it to IE in a number of ways. And so I wanted to discuss this here, given this group's interest in ethology. As you all know, what Goodall did in Tanzania was observe chimpanzees. When she began work, she didn't have a typical animal behavior research background and did not approach her work using existing theories about animal behavior focused on, for example, understanding the cause, evolution, development, or function of animal behaviors. Further, Jane did not use tools specifically developed to quantify what animals were doing. Instead, she approached learning about the chimps primarily through observations of what they were actually doing in their everyday lives, what they ate, how they fought, how they got along. This approach of observing actual everyday practices of people, or in this case chimpanzees, is what Smith says she means by an ontology focused on discovery. This approach is also linked to the ethnographic nature of IE. So ethnographic studies typically involve long-term observations of settings and what people or animals, especially in the case of multi-species ethnography, for example, what those people and animals are doing in their daily lives and how they're putting their worlds together. However, a big difference between how the chimps in Tanzania put their world together and the world that I started inquiry into, which is animal sheltering, is that what happens to animals in shelters is hooked into a set of textually mediated, organized processes, policies, and laws. The actual lives of people working in these settings, and therefore the animals that they are caring for, is extremely organized by processes and procedures that organize what people do in their everyday work. So fairly soon, this was a number of years ago, after I learned about IE and also heard Smith speaking about the connections between IE and Goodall's work, I started thinking about how I could use IE to understand how what happens to animals in settings where we care for them, for example, in shelters, is organized. So to do this, I took what is referred to in IE as the standpoint. I took the standpoint of animals. I want to reiterate, I was not trying to understand the affective experiences of animals, but rather I was taking their standpoint as a point of entry into inquiry, into research, and to rather kind of use their place in shelters as a location to begin my investigation. So what this meant was that I observed animals that for various reasons came to be involved with animal sheltering and protection from the point that they arrived in the shelter or were part of investigations to the point when they exited. So in this project, I spent most of my time doing data collection, observing animals, but then also observing people and shadowing what people, especially frontline staff working in shelters directly with animals, what they were doing, and then how what they were doing was organizing what was happening to animals. These people frequently utilized physical and digital texts and documents, which I then also collected and analyzed. I also talked to people in more kind of informal interviews about the different steps they were taking as they were doing their everyday work, and also convened focus groups where we could talk together about some of those work processes. Indeed, in this way, another important core part of IE is that texts are the material form of institutions. So when people would utilize texts and indeed activate them as they were doing their work, this was a really important part for me to kind of pay attention to how these texts were organizing their everyday work, but then also where those texts were coming from and how they were ultimately organizing the daily processes in the shelter. So while collecting data, I also paid attention to tensions that came up in work. And these tensions arose as frustrations or conflict that for various reasons arose in everyday work, but seemed to misalign with what was supposed to be happening following standardized procedures. So I then began mapping how those tensions were occurring and how they seemed to ultimately contradict what people were trying to achieve for animals and the overall mission and goals of the shelter. So identifying these tensions and trying to figure out how they're being organized brings me to another really important IE term, which is problematic. So in IE, the problematic refers to a set of questions that arises as these tensions or moments of disjuncture in the everyday world from the standpoint location, and then these disjunctures direct further inquiry. So from this standpoint of animals and focusing on different tensions that arose from them, I aim to map how individuals coordinate activities through work processes and texts, and then also how to map the processes, policies, and laws that coordinate those activities. So after that brief introduction to IE, I'd like to explain a little bit about what actually doing IE looks like. So I'm going to share one of my thesis chapters, which is focused on the social organization of animal shelter work. And to do that, I'd like to share an excerpt from an ethnographic account that introduces a dog named Henry. I met Henry, a large 6-year-old dog, a few days after he had been transferred to the shelter from another branch. Henry had been removed from a home by animal protection officers a few weeks earlier because he was determined to be in distress. Notes on Henry's file made by frontline staff indicate that he is stressed and has some other challenging behaviors. He barks and lunges at other dogs and barks at people as they pass by his kennel. In a formal behavioral assessment that uses colors to categorize dogs from green, being a well-behaved, easily adoptable animal, to red, an animal with severe and potentially harmful behaviors, Henry was assessed as orange, which designates him as an animal with some challenges that need to be managed and improved upon before he can be adopted safely into the community. Staff and volunteers record notes about Henry on forums and checklists posted on his kennel. They do some work with behavioral modification and leave notes for volunteers to also do this work. In a staff meeting about a week after I met Henry, staff note that they are worried about Henry because he has stayed in the shelter for an extended period of time and is still very stressed in his kennel. Another dog in the shelter is adopted, and so staff move Henry to this quieter area, thinking that this might help with his stress levels. The following week, Henry has received an adoption application, but this falls through, unfortunately. As the days pass, staff know that it is becoming more and more difficult for Henry to focus on them after seeing a dog. And some volunteers no longer feel comfortable walking Henry. Staff are sad when, after about 60 days after Henry entered the shelter, he was euthanized because his challenging behaviors were deemed too severe for him to live safely in the community. This account provides a glimpse of frontline shelter staff work, that of conducting behavioral assessments, daily animal care, and this is likely very recognizable to those who have worked or volunteered in shelters. Also recognizable is Henry's status as an orange animal, or an animal with challenging behaviors, and the sadness of shelter staff when Henry is ultimately euthanized. This account also generates questions about how Henry's life unfolded in the shelter. For example, how do staff spend their time? What directs their work activities? How do texts and protocols enter into their work? So it is with these guiding questions and the account about Henry that I use as an entry point to explore how this series of tensions, again, this is the problematic, arises in the everyday work of frontline shelter staff as they work with animals like Henry with behavioral problems. So one of the first work processes that I started learning about and observing was conducting these behavioral assessments. So all dogs over 5 months of age are categorized using this assessment. And this was a routine work process that I observed staff do. And I had numerous opportunities to talk to them about this process and understand how they did it. As I observed staff complete the assessment and then complete the paper form, which they then took and entered into the computer, which then generated a profile for each dog, it seemed that one way that staff understood this assessment was to identify special considerations for potential people who might be interested in adopting Henry. So in Henry's case, this was his reactivity and his prey drive. And that meant that placing him in a home with cats or other small animals would be inappropriate. And so correspondingly, a box on Henry's profile next to no cats is checked. Another way that this seemed to resonate with staff was about removing barriers to adoption. And they would frequently reference the Adopters Welcome program. And this is a program developed by the Humane Society of the United States that ultimately aimed to make adopting animals easier from shelters. So some of the barriers that might be removed would be requiring people to spend a certain amount of hours at home with their animal, or requiring them to have a backyard, for example. So again, these two conducting behavioral assessments in this way was linked to working with adopters, both letting them know about special considerations, but also reducing barriers so that animals like Henry could be adopted. Excuse me. This assessment was also linked to accountability. So records of animals would be kept for several years, and assessments could be referred to if an animal was returned shortly after adoption. So this was set up to protect volunteers, or excuse me, protect adopters. Excuse me. First, and additionally, volunteers, they were not allowed to interact with dogs until those dogs had been assessed. And then also dogs with especially reactive or mouthy or jumpy behaviors that could even unintentionally harm a person, they were only allowed to be handled by volunteers with more experience or even just frontline staff. So the next thing that I explored was how doing behavioral modification work actually entered into what frontline staff did every day. And so first, as I mentioned, dogs that are assessed as orange are referred to in the assessment as dogs that need to be managed. They have to improve upon their behavioral challenges before they can be adopted. And this is linked to the Assimilar Accords and adoptability guidelines. This is a set of guidelines that was developed in 2004 in North America by about 20 sheltering experiments and back in 2004. So at the SPCA, they utilize these guidelines to determine adoptability of animals, and then have also integrated their specific dog behavioral assessment into these Assimilar Accords. However, even though orange animals need to be managed and improve upon their behaviors, making time for doing behavioral modification was challenging and a source of stress and pressure for staff. So this quote shows the responsibilities embedded in staff's work and how they worried about finishing everything while also feeling responsible to find all of the animals home. This was one person said, "What if I don't have enough time to spend with that animal? Knowing that the shelter environment is more stressful. If only I had a foster, if only I had more volunteers. I feel stretched thin in a sense of, I still have to do the dishes, but if I don't spend enough time with that animal, and she doesn't make improvements soon, a decision to euthanize might have to get made." In contrast, administrators saw doing behavioral modification as a specialized task that required additional training and knowledge. And they were also aware that human resources across shelters were insufficient to do behavioral modification. Despite this, however, staff felt compelled to help even those animals with challenging behaviors to remediate some of those challenging behaviors so that they could make progress and hopefully get adopted. Finally, in addition to providing daily care for animals and trying to fit in behavioral modification work, staff also performed many administrative tasks, and much of this revolved around monitoring and anticipating animals that were coming into the shelter. For example, optimal animal housing. Daily work activities that I observed were involved moving animals around within the shelters to accommodate for special needs. And this required a lot of knowledge by frontline staff, but it also took time. Animals were transferred across branches within the province to decrease length of stay and increase prompt adoption. Further, staff followed standardized animal intake procedures for different categories of animals like strays, animal neglect or cruelty cases, and animals that were surrendered or relinquished. These and other practices are all part of capacity for care, or C4C. And this is the shelter management approach that's utilized not only here in BC, but across shelters in North America. The broad focus of C4C has been described throughout this, these initial slides about Henry and the work involved with Henry. So there's the work of decreasing length of stay and euthanasia by minimizing barriers to adoption, trying to improve the welfare of animals by housing them based on their needs. All of this work is connected to C4C, and staff's time was ultimately organized around much of these activities. So in summary, animals with behavioral problems like Henry face complicated and unstable pathways to adoption, and this arises as a series of tensions in the everyday work of frontline staff. These tensions arise because frontline staff are organized to perform work activities and administrative tasks based on Bailey care and achieving C4C shelter management approaches. Ultimately, this seems at odds with the shelter's goal to help all animals and adopt all animals. Nobody at the shelter, I want to reiterate that no one at the shelter intends for this to happen. But the analysis that I did reveals the way that C4C and staff responsibilities actually play out in the daily work routines and how this functions to disadvantage animals like Henry. One discussion point for this chapter that sheds a bit of a different light on a very dominant theme in animal sheltering literature, which is focused on euthanasia-related stress, is that staff felt an immense time pressure and a perceived ethical obligation to help even animals with behavioral problems. So the literature typically focuses on staff's involvement with performing euthanasia. Whereas here, staff felt more pressured and an ethical responsibility to help get animals adoptable, even if they didn't have time to do it. So their schedules and their work tests were prioritizing more the management and the monitoring of these populations of animals. And ultimately that left a lot less time to work with animals like Henry. So the next chapter I'd like to share with you today is about the everyday work of providing alternative measures. Broadly, this work falls into categories and concepts that are incredibly common in animal sheltering today. Some of those include one welfare, one health, keeping families together, importance of the human bond, human-animal bond, etc. So in this chapter, what I did was I tried to provide detailed information about the actual material work that is involved with these kinds of concepts. So in brief, what would this look like? Basically, officers would respond to calls from supportive housing buildings or single room occupancy buildings, that's subsidized housing, and speak to the manager, visit the tenant. In many cases, tenants were physically or mentally ill, were perhaps receiving other forms of support or experiencing cognitive decline. In such situations, officers made decisions about whether to give orders to individuals that they would have to follow to relieve distress in their animals or face legal consequences, or provide alternative measures, for example, in the form of free pet food or supplies or referrals to free clinics. Thus, this work generates questions about the work that officers do in situations where an animal is not in distress as it is legally defined, but where the conditions that the animal is living in are seriously suboptimal, and the owner requires support to improve their animal's well-being. So next, I'll present a preliminary analysis of the everyday work of providing alternative measures. The growing discourse about the benefits of keeping people and animals together may result in some unforeseen consequences for owners, animal protection staff, and animals as well. Based on what I saw officers doing and I heard them discussing even before I started this project was that they always tried to provide alternative measures so that people and their animals could stay together. Now, however, this work is part of the strategic plan of the BCSPCA, and there are now formal measures in place used to track this work. For example, there's a request form that officers and staff can fill out if they'd like to request financial or veterinary assistance for someone. In many cases, providing alternative measures works. It works really well for people and animals and the organization. Pets can stay with their families while receiving some form of assistance. Those animals don't end up in shelters. And further, the organization can provide information on their annual reports in terms of metrics, for example, the number of animals that they're providing free food for in the community. Of course, however, the actual work that is involved in this that I briefly described before highlights that there's a myriad of tasks involved. Officers must evaluate the situation, considering offering different services, develop relationships with supportive housing staff, as well as the people that are involved, and offer supplies to people so that they can then try and improve the welfare of their animals. In other cases, however, providing alternative measures did not always result in improved outcomes. And this often happened when alternative measures were supplied on repeat occasions. So I want to share a quote from an officer in a focus group that demonstrates this very well. Every year I show up and it's the exact same concerns. And we've offered alternative measure after alternative measure after alternative measure. We've brought bales of straw for the doghouse, door flaps, dog food, dog bowls, enrichment, you name it, we've brought it. We were bordering on getting a warrant last week to remove their new dog because they replaced their dog that died with a new dog in the exact same situation. I was telling a new administrator about the case and they asked me, what kind of alternative measures can you offer? And I said, at this point, the only thing I can offer is physical labor. That's where we're at. Me walking their dog, moving their doghouse, that's all we have left. We've now proven beyond a doubt that we have tried everything. So this quote notes and kind of points out two things. One, that providing alternative measures is part of an institutional goal that officers are asked about by their supervisors and directed towards trying to achieve. As well, it also points out that when alternative measures don't work and they fail, they might be another means as building a strong case to support, let's say if the officers did decide to get a warrant and remove the dog from this situation. Providing alternative measures often required frontline staff and officers to coordinate their work with human social services. This includes social workers and police, supportive housing staff. There were also calls, and there are also calls in strategic plans, as well as the literature about One Health and One Welfare, calls to collaborate and for multi-agency collaboration and work in order to try and achieve some of these alternative measures. So I often saw officers and frontline staff develop rapport and relationships with these human social services staff. In other cases, however, officers and frontline expressed frustrations from doing this work to where they were coming into it to try and protect animals. And they broadly spoke about miscommunications or misunderstandings between their work and trying to protect animals and then what human social services staff were then doing. So one of the first misunderstandings really revolved around the BC SPCA is to enforce the PCA Act, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is the provincial legislation here in BC that protects and cares for animals. This mandate basically allows officers to take action for animals when they are in distress, as that is legally defined. But they're often being called to situations where animals weren't in distress. And so this kind of conflicted a bit with what they were legally mandated to do. The second misunderstanding revolved around human social services staff not being aware or on top of animal welfare concerns. So I remember one specific conversation I had with a staff member, and this was focused on their frustration of having to deal with a cat hoarding situation, which created much more work for their staff, required a large intake of about 20 cats at one time, and it really changed how they were going to then have to manage these cats that came in all at once into their shelter. The frustration was that the social worker didn't necessarily see the problem or see what was happening or what was going wrong with the situation. But when they finally did, and when they finally communicated with the sheltering staff, it was almost too late in a sense, as the staff then had to quickly provide care for these animals, but then also make difficult euthanasia decisions and start doing behavioral modification work with these animals. So this is a preliminary analysis, but it points out that some of the concepts revolving around keeping people and animals together, they're incredibly complex and poorly misunderstood. However, even this preliminary analysis suggests that this growing discourse about keeping people and animals together is resulting in some unforeseen issues for owners and for animals, as well as animal sheltering and protection staff that are not yet well understood. I have a few different questions for further analysis that I would be interested in exploring that I wanted to share with you here today. For example, how do officers determine when providing alternative measures is not resolving problems? What do officers do when animal owners need physical, mental, or other support to care for their animal? How are miscommunications between frontline staff, both for animals and people, organized? So again, this is a preliminary analysis, but using IE, I think it's really allowed us to see some of these really detailed, complex issues that are coming up when One Welfare and One Health work are being put into practice. So I'd like to conclude with a few summary points. First, institutional ethnography, or IE, has a core focus on an ontological shift to discovery, and a large focus on what is actually materially going on, the social processes and everyday knowledge. Next, animals with challenging behaviors face complicated pathways to adoption, as certain work priorities are prioritized by staff. Providing alternative measures may result in unforeseen consequences for animals, owners, and frontline staff. some of the results that I've shared with you today actually pull out a lot of what I've been hearing as an animal shelter volunteer for the past almost 12 years now, and more research about animal sheltering and protection, which is that things are different than they were now 10 or 20 years ago. These kinds of animals that are coming in with really challenging behaviors, or this new focus on trying to provide alternative measures to keep people and animals together in communities. So using IE, especially, you know, as I reflect upon my previous experiences of volunteering in shelters, I feel that it's been a really helpful way to dive into and really in-depth investigate some of these actual issues that are happening and how they're actually happening in the everyday work of frontline staff in animal sheltering and protection. Building upon some of the research questions that I mentioned, I think, you know, there's a lot that we can investigate further. I think that more in-depth ethnographic observations are critical. They really open up different things that are happening that are difficult to, you know, summarize in a survey or an interview or focus group projects. So I really enjoy doing these kinds of observations, and I think they can really highlight interesting data and research. A major goal of IE is to use the research as a tool for understanding how everyday processes work, and then ultimately to figure out how things could be changed to make life better from the standpoint of animals in this case, but also people. This could be done in the form of tweaks to existing policies and everyday procedures. By no means is this to, you know, throw everything out that exists already. But in fact, thinking about the work with Henry on the topic of behavioral assessments or behavioral modification, there might be potential tweaks to existing policies and everyday procedures there that could improve the work both for people and potentially animal outcomes. Beyond that, because IE is really focused on what actually happens and the everyday knowledge of people, I think doing participatory workshops with frontline staff, or perhaps even participatory workshops with human social services staff and animal social services staff would be really interesting to kind of make some connections between the everyday work that these people are doing, how different policies and protocols are organizing their work. Another idea is an institutional analysis audit. This is a really interesting idea that was developed by researchers in Minnesota based on a PhD thesis about domestic violence. And what they did was identify tensions and conflicts, for example, the gaps between what victims of gender-based violence needed and then the legal and human social services that were intervening to help those people actually did. And they noticed, you know, different gaps between what people actually needed and what was actually being offered and provided. So here, for example, like with Henry, how could we set up an audit to kind of analyze these everyday work process to understand how they could be modified to better meet the overall goals of this organization? And then finally, I love institutional ethnography. I'm always thinking about, even in my postdoctoral work now, of how I can use the principles of IE. And so I think doing IE in other settings where people care for animals, be it on farms or in laboratories or in zoos, aquariums, would be incredibly interesting. So if I'd love to talk with you if you have ideas about that there. And with that, I'll conclude with just a huge thank you to Dr. David Fraser, my supervisor, Dr. Janet Rankin, and Dr. Nina von Kaising were also on my committee and so incredibly helpful to me during the course of my doctoral work. Of course, the BCS-BCA and all of the frontline staff, officers, call center operators, volunteers that participated in this project. I wouldn't be here without you. And of course, all of the animals that I met and got to learn about. And then I did want to briefly mention I had a really interesting opportunity to be part of a documentary with Dorothy Smith. So if you're interested in learning more about Dorothy Smith and how she developed IE in her life, maybe I can throw the link in the chat there if that's convenient. It's about a 20-minute documentary that I had a really special opportunity to be a part of. So I wanted to share that with you as well. And I'll end it there and open up to any questions.
What a pleasure, Katie. Thank you so much for sharing your work. It's in some ways very original and unique. So really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. While I wait for the questions to come in, I was wondering if I could start with one of my own. You've mentioned this in a few different contexts with your follow-up questions, wanting to think about tweaks to systems. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. It sounds like the staff working at the shelter had to wear a lot of hats, like they had to wear the administration hat, animal care, animal behavior. And do you think part of the tension that arises was from asking people to be skilled in too many areas? And would streamlining employees into like a specialization maybe help? Or do you have other solutions that you've thought of for that particular tension?
Mm, that's a really good question. And it's actually like, and with IE in general, kind of mapping out how things are working and how things are organized is a big first step to do, and then figuring out recommendations and what to do. That's the really tricky part, I guess, with everything, but especially in an IE context, because there's such a value and an honoring of people's knowledge that are actually doing the work every day. And so that's why I've had, a few opportunities to begin to present, this work to the sheltering organization. And so I'm always trying to ask them. So yeah, knowing this now, or, having, me come in and kind of do this really in-depth analysis of the everyday work processes, and maybe even in some cases, if the mapping the organization of, okay, well, this, behavioral assessment is connected to this larger, set of guidelines, and that's important, on these different levels. Even that kind of mapping, I think, can be really helpful in a way, just to see, because when you're working in every day and doing basic care for animals and intake assessments and all of that, it can be hard, I think, sometimes to see how everything is ultimately connected. So that's one piece that I feel like is just, a helpful way to say, okay, this is, when we're doing this task, here's, perhaps some of how it's connected into this larger mission. But it also, that's where those tensions arise. And so something I am trying to do, and when I'm talking with especially frontline staff and others that are involved in some of these, policies, is that knowing what we know now, or knowing how this current policy or this protocol is disadvantaging some animals, how might we change it? What are your kind of ideas to do that? So so I will say it's hard to find those really key recommendations, because they have to, I think, come from the people that are going to continue doing them, and working together to figure out, okay, well, now that we know how this is actually being put together and how our work is being organized, we might be able to do this here. So yeah, I don't have a good answer. I know that, yeah, some shelters certainly do have specialized, staff for doing behavioral modification, or, for maybe doing veterinary work, or more, kind of daily care work. But what I can say too is, even if, the staff that were, more focused on like a customer service role, they were really passionate about even helping animals with those challenging behaviors. They knew them, they saw them every day. So maybe, and their interactions with them are shaping those animals' experiences while they're in the shelter. So I think there's a lot to kind of, piece together and acknowledge there about the everyday work that people are doing with these animals.
Thanks for that. And I really like the idea of mapping things out. There's something very refreshing about taking a piece of paper or a whiteboard and just like going to town of how things work in any sort of problem, I find. So it's a good point to remember to go back to the basics sometimes, just to be like, okay, where are people coming from? So yeah, that's a very interesting observation. We do have a comment from Jen. Hi, Katie, really interesting work. I'm curious that from an IE point of view, when your subjects involve both human and non-human agents, how do you tell a story that can give the non-humans more voice and agency? As I imagine, it may be easier to document the humans because they can talk and record things, but not the animals. For example, in Henry's case, when you observed him, did he also have a say in the things that happened around him? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this question. And this was something I thought about and think about all the time. And I know, yeah, many of you do too, is just that, we observe animals and we have different ways of understanding them. But yeah, it's very different than working with people, obviously. So that's really important. And I even initially, when I started this project in IE, Smith and others use the word experience. So what are people's everyday experiences, and how is that being organized? And right away, it was difficult to translate that word, and say what are animals' experiences, because again, that there's lots of ways of interpreting what animals' experiences are, and so I reflected about this a lot. So I appreciate the question. A lot of I tried to, again, observe kind of in an area where I could observe all the animals, and in other cases I would observe an animal from entry to exit, when they came in, be it as a stray or a surrender. I would observe all of the processes that happened to them, I guess. So an animal would come in, and there's immediately paperwork and text being utilized. There's different paperwork that are used to assess the health of the animal, the behavior of the animal. There's the property of the animal that has to be transferred, from one person to the sheltering organization. That's the signatures are required with that. Then there's the placement of the animal, whether the animal can be accepted into the shelter. That's relating back to again, kind of capacity for care, and thinking about how many animals can shelter staff care for and provide humane care for, given their resources. So it was more from that perspective that I was really focusing on the institutional organization of animals. So, but trying just to follow, even those, I guess in that case, the animals don't really have a say, because it's very organized in terms of, okay, if this is, even from when they arrived, if it's a stray animal or a surrendered animal, there's a different pathway that then they're going down. Or if it's a neglect case or a cruelty case that is involved with the legal issues, there's a different pathway for that. So right from that very point, the animals are categorized, and that categorization then dictates what's going to happen to them, what staff can do for them, how they make decisions for them. Of course, like with Henry's case, there is also his challenging behaviors, and there are some resources to do behavioral modification work with animals. But that was where that tension really arose, where there was this sense of pressure, this ethical obligation, where there was just so many other things that were prioritized in the daily work that meant that there wasn't enough time for Henry. So I guess that's a little bit of an answer, but with IE, there is a large focus on what's the institutional organization. How is that shaping what happens to animals, where in some cases they don't really have a say, and that's where those tensions arise. So thanks, Jen. Hopefully I answered your question there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Katie. Changing topics just a little bit. You were bringing up an interesting future direction question, and the way I understood it to be the relationship between animals being in these situations and also their human partner, and that person might be especially in neglect situations or surrender situations, in some state of physical or mental ill health. And I'm wondering, is there a system, in this case, does the SPCA have systems in place to actually navigate the human welfare component as well? Or is it all very based on the animal, and there's not really a good way to give different groups acknowledgement that maybe this human needs extra care too?
Thanks for that question. And I think a lot of the work, and even in the literature as well, that's trying to investigate how, and for example, a lot of this has been done with hoarding cases, animal hoarding cases, where there's maybe a person owns some animals, but it gets to a point there's just too many animals that they can actually provide good care for, and then shelters will get involved. I think this is such a complex issue when I kind of look at it from the actual material work, that there are ways that officers can connect kind of via word of mouth. So that was often what they did. They knew about a mental health worker here in this area, and if they didn't, they could maybe connect. Maybe there was someone in a different part of the province, but they knew this one person who could make some connections there. They knew about local kind of assistance, resources for people with the Salvation Army, or human food banks that would then provide pet food as well. So in terms of what they kind of did to try and help with human welfare, there was a lot of word of mouth kind of happening and everything. But again, there was a lot of that also included developing relationships with, you know, those individuals who were working in supportive housing or things like that. So that was really interesting and so impressive to see how officers and staff would know about those connections and know about those resources and provide them as much as possible. And to me, and that's what I'm always so interested in looking into one welfare and diving into what that means, and beyond kind of calls for a multi-jurisdictional or a multi-agency approach, which is wonderful and critical, you know, to doing work in this area. But the actual processes of what does that look like? What does it mean to do a multi-agency approach? It's a very complex. And again, there's lots of laws and policies that are involved. That's something I talk about a little bit from just, you know, working and speaking with some supportive housing staff. They have residential tenancy agreements, work with the police department, fire safety, all of those, you know, procedures that they must follow in order to protect, you know, the safety of the people that are in those buildings. So it was often, you know, and that's why I think too, doing a kind of participatory workshop where human social services and animal social services could, you know, get together and talk about some of those links, and also, you know, recognize a lot of it is standardized and focuses on, you know, I guess, meeting certain requirements or accountability, things like that. But that also, you know, creates some tensions for people, like, let's say, like Henry in this situation we talked about a lot, or others where they don't quite fit into that system the way that it's currently organized. And that's where those tensions kind of bubble up.
Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you so much for that answer. I think One Health, it's just so complex, but it's such an interesting way of looking at the world and seeing, especially some of the big issues facing us today. So thanks for sharing those thoughts. It doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat. So I think this is a good place to end, unless you have any final thoughts you would like to share. But it has been just a true pleasure to see you, Katie, and to hear your fantastic work. And I think we've all learned a lot.
Wonderful. No, thank you. I'll just pop, there we go. That's just a link to the documentary if anyone's interested in that. And just thank you so much again, Laura and Christian and the Applying Ethology webinar series group. You're so wonderful. And thank you for hosting me, and thanks for all the interesting questions.
Thanks, Katie.